The midday sun scorched the cracked earth outside of Abilene, Texas. The old livestock arena buzzed with distant conversations, bootsteps on dry boards, and the occasional cough from an aging rancher leaning against the railing. Dust swirled in lazy circles beneath the bleachers. Men in sweat-stained hats and faded denim stood shoulder to shoulder, arms crossed, eyes narrowed at what was about to enter the ring. The gate creaked open with a groan, and an old, battered horse limped through. His ribs showed through a dull, matted coat, and his left hind leg dragged slightly with every step. Murmurs began. Snickers followed. "What the hell is that?" someone whispered with a chuckle. "That ain't a horse. That's a damn skeleton on hooves." The laughter grew. The heat, the judgment, and the air were suffocating. But right behind the horse walked Boone Mercer, head held high, shoulders square. He was a man carved by years of drought, disappointment, and quiet endurance. His face was shadowed beneath a worn black hat, his gray beard cut short, and his boots caked in red dirt. Boone wasn't here to win respect. He'd already lost everything that ever mattered, except the animal walking beside him, the one the crowd was mocking. The horse's name was Justice, and Boone had brought him not to sell, but to confront the ghosts that still haunted both of them. The auctioneer, Rex Marlowe, hesitated. "All right," he drawled into the mic, voice cracking slightly. "Let's start this one at $5. Anybody?" Silence. Then, a voice from the crowd shouted, "You ought to be paying someone to take that thing off your hands, old man." Boone stepped forward, slow and steady, like he was carrying the weight of an entire life. He took off his hat and let his voice carry across the ring. "He ain't for sale." A pause. Murmurs again. "I brought him here so you'd all see what loyalty looks like." Boone turned, looking down at the horse, his voice softening. "The night I nearly put a bullet in my own head, this horse, this bag of bones you're laughing at, broke down a locked barn door just to reach me." The laughter stopped. The dust seemed to hang heavier in the air. "He didn't leave me then," Boone said. "And I won't leave him now." For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. And yet, something shifted. Behind every hardened stare, a flicker of discomfort, or maybe recognition. But none of them, not even Boone, knew that this moment was only the beginning. Because Justice carried more than scars. He carried a truth that hadn't seen daylight in decades. As the crowd dispersed from the arena, Boone led Justice back to the old trailer parked under the shadow of a dead cottonwood tree. The trailer had seen better days. Rust climbed its seams, and the ramp groaned beneath the weight of time and memory. Boone didn't speak. He simply ran a brush gently across the horse's bony shoulder, his calloused hands moving with a tenderness that most men there had never seen in him. The brush caught on a deep scar just behind Justice's neck. Boone paused. That mark had a story, and it wasn't Boone's alone. From across the lot, Grady Kane watched silently, arms crossed. Years ago, he and Boone had been like brothers, sharing fence lines, cattle drives, and whiskey bottles. But the past had splintered them. Grady had taken the easy road when times got hard, and Boone had chosen a road that damn near broke him. "You always were too proud for your own good," Grady muttered under his breath. But the sight of that broken horse standing so still beside Boone, it hit something deeper, something he'd buried. Inside the auction office, Rex Marlowe leaned over his clipboard but wasn't reading anything. His eyes were locked on Boone through the grimy window. "Why the hell would he bring that animal here?" he asked, not expecting an answer. Next to him, a younger ranch hand shrugged. "Maybe to prove a point." Rex scoffed. "A point don't pay bills." But even as he said it, something about Boone's words, "He didn't leave me then, and I won't leave him now," played over in his mind like a stuck record. Back at the trailer, Boone sat on a worn folding chair, staring into the fading light. He pulled an old leather wallet from his back pocket and opened it. Inside, next to a faded photo of Maeve, his late wife, was a small, folded piece of paper, creased, yellowed, stained with age. It was a letter she'd written just days before she passed. He hadn't read it in over 10 years. But something about today, the stares, the shame, the way justice stood by him. It made Boone unfold it with trembling fingers. The letter spoke of forgiveness, of letting go of guilt, of finding meaning in what remained, even if it was just a horse and a broken-down trailer. Boone's throat tightened. Maeve had always seen the truth before he did. And now, with justice beside him, it felt like her voice had returned, carried in dust and memory. Just then, a knock on the trailer's side jolted him. Boone stood, surprised. Outside stood a stranger, a man in a brown vest, holding a camera and a notepad. "Name's Thatcher Wynne, sir," he said. "Mind if I ask why you really brought that horse here today?" Boone eyed the man cautiously. The name Thatcher Wynne didn't mean much to him, but the camera slung over the man's shoulder told its own story. Someone who captured things, judged things, broadcast things. Boone had spent most of his life avoiding people like that. Still, something about Thatcher's tone was different. He wasn't selling anything. He wasn't chasing spectacle. His voice held a kind of quiet reverence. "I was in the stands," Thatcher said. "You said something back there, about the horse saving your life. That true?" Boone hesitated. Justice let out a soft breath behind him, his ribs rising like tired hills. Boone stepped down from the trailer ramp, letting the metal clank echo across the dirt lot. "Depends," he finally said, his voice rough. "You writing some sob story for your website, or do you actually give a damn?" Thatcher didn't flinch. "I give a damn," he replied. "More than most." The silence between them settled like dust, heavy and still. Boone looked him over, then nodded toward a wooden bench nearby. "Then sit." As they did, Boone reached for a canteen and poured some water into a shallow dish for Justice. The horse drank slowly, methodically. Thatcher glanced over. "He looks bad," he said gently. "But there's something in his eyes. Like he remembers everything." Boone gave a single nod. "He does." Then, after a pause, he added, "And not all of it's good." He shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming against the old wood. "I've had him since the day I buried my wife," he said. "And I haven't spent a day since without thinking about what I could have done different." Thatcher scribbled something, then stopped, looking up. "What happened, Boone?" The name came out soft, like he wasn't sure if he'd earned the right to use it. Boone stared into the horizon for a moment before answering. "I lost everything. Maeve got sick. I couldn't afford the meds. Couldn't save the ranch. My boy, Silas, blamed me for all of it. He left. Told me not to call again." His voice cracked slightly, but he cleared his throat. "Only thing that stayed was justice. And I didn't even deserve that." A gust of wind kicked up dirt and old memories. "You think anyone wants to hear that?" Boone asked, not bitter, just tired. "An old man with nothing but regrets and a dying horse?" Thatcher leaned forward. "That's exactly why they need to hear it. Because it's real. And because you're still standing." Boone didn't respond, but the way his jaw clenched said enough. And deep in the corner of the trailer, buried under an old saddle, was something Thatcher didn't know about yet, a box that hadn't been opened in over 20 years. Inside it, a photo that would turn the story on its head. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the gravel lot. Inside Boone's trailer, the scent of old leather and hay lingered in the warm air. Justice shifted his weight with a quiet grunt, as if he could feel what was coming. Boone hesitated, hand resting on the rusted latch of the storage chest tucked beneath a saddle draped in dust. For over 2 decades, he hadn't touched that box. He had buried it, not in the ground but in silence. Thatcher stood just inside the doorway, watching with careful respect. He sensed that something important was about to be unearthed, something that had less to do with the horse and more to do with the man. Boone slowly opened the box. The hinges squeaked in protest, as if the past itself were resisting. Inside, there were a few yellowed envelopes, an old bandana, and a black and white photograph curled at the edges. Boone picked it up and stared. In the photo, a young man stood beside a horse that looked unmistakably like Justice, but younger, proud, and powerful. Next to the man was a teenage boy, dark-haired, strong-jawed, with his hand resting on the horse's bridle. Silas, Boone's son. The moment froze Boone's breath in his chest. He hadn't looked at that face in years. "This was before Maeve got sick," he murmured, almost to himself. "Before Silas hated me." Thatcher stepped closer. "You trained that horse together?" Boone nodded. "We did everything together. That horse was supposed to be his." His voice dropped to a whisper. "But the world went sideways fast, and I stopped being the man they needed me to be." There was no theatrical grief in Boone's tone, just the kind of quiet devastation that lingers long after tears dry. Thatcher carefully took a picture of the photo with his phone, then looked Boone in the eye. "Let me tell this right." Boone folded the photo back into the envelope with a kind of reverence, sealing it again as if putting the past back into its chamber. "Why now?" he asked. "Why tell my story when I'm damn near invisible to the world?" Thatcher's voice was firm but sincere. "Because the world's full of people who've fallen apart and don't know what to do next. Maybe they need to see that a man like you, broken, alone, dragging through the dust, still shows up. Still protects something." Boone didn't answer, but there was a shift in his eyes. Not hope, exactly, but something less dark. Justice let out a low, breathy snort, as if affirming it. And somewhere far from that dusty lot, in a town Boone hadn't spoken of in years, Silas Mercer stared at an email notification on his phone. The subject line, "The horse that wouldn't leave." Silas Mercer hadn't seen his father's name in years. When the email came through, he thought it was spam, another junk article or automated farm newsletter. But something made him open it. The headline hit like a fist to the chest. "The horse that wouldn't leave. An old man, his dying stallion, and a promise that never broke." He stared at the screen for a long time, then slowly sat down at his kitchen table, the room around him suddenly feeling too quiet. His wife, Lena, entered carrying their infant daughter. "Everything okay?" she asked gently. Silas didn't answer right away. He was reading the first lines of Thatcher Wynn's article, the ones describing Boone in the auction ring. Ridiculed, surrounded by laughter, refusing to sell the horse everyone had already given up on. Lena leaned closer. "Is that about your dad?" she whispered. He nodded slowly, jaw clenched. "I thought he was gone." His voice cracked, the anger softened by something unexpected. Sorrow. Back in Abilene, Boone stood by the fence line as the sky turned to copper. Justice rested under the shade, too tired to move much now. Thatcher's article had gone live barely 2 hours ago, and his phone hadn't stopped buzzing. Boone ignored it. He didn't need the world's sympathy. He hadn't shared his story for attention. He had shared it because, for the first time in years, someone had asked. Still, the weight in his chest hadn't lifted. Redemption was never loud. It whispered and waited. Thatcher sat on the tailgate of his truck, scrolling through hundreds of comments flooding in. Stories from strangers who had lost fathers, mothers, horses, themselves. One comment stood out. "If your father is Boone Mercer, you need to go to him. Not tomorrow. Now." Thatcher looked up at Boone, who hadn't moved in 20 minutes. He debated showing him. But something told him Boone already felt it, that somehow, across miles of silence, he knew. That same evening, far from the dusty lot, Silas packed a bag. He hadn't spoken to Boone since Maeve's funeral. Years of resentment, pride, and pain stood between them like a canyon. But the story, the photo in the article, the way Boone had held on to that horse like he was holding on to time itself, it cracked something open. He looked at Lena, who only nodded. "Go." And as the first stars appeared above the Texas plains, Boone looked toward the road, his hand resting gently on Justice's withers. He didn't know Silas had read the article. He didn't know Silas was already driving west. But for the first time in years, Boone Mercer waited. The road stretched endlessly before Silas, flat, straight, and quiet. The hum of the tires was the only sound inside the truck, except for the occasional rustle from the old duffel bag in the passenger seat. He hadn't been to Abilene since he was 19. The trees along the highway looked shorter than he remembered. Or maybe it was just him, older now, heavier with years he'd spent trying not to feel anything about the man he was going to see. Back at the lot, Boone sat by Justice's side as the horse lay resting in the shade. Boone could see it in his eyes, the cloudiness, the shallow breaths. The long walks were getting shorter, the silence between them deeper. He laid a hand on the animal's neck, and for a moment the horse pressed his head gently into Boone's chest. "No words, just understanding," Boone whispered. "You held on for me, didn't you?" Justice blinked, slow and tired. Thatcher Wynne stood nearby, quietly snapping a few last photos with his camera. But this time, it wasn't for the article. It was for Boone. "He's not just a horse," Thatcher had said earlier. "He's the part of your soul you thought was dead." Boone didn't argue. He just nodded. The article had gone viral. People had reached out from all over the country. Donations were coming in. Offers to adopt Justice. But Boone declined them all. "He stays with me," he said. "To the end." Hours later, as the sun began to set, a layer of gold settled across the dirt. A truck approached the lot, slow, hesitant. Boone stood when he heard the engine cut. Silas stepped out, older than Boone remembered him. He wore a gray hoodie and jeans, and in his eyes, Boone saw everything. Pride, pain, anger, and something deeper, guilt. For a moment, neither man moved. Justice stirred at the sound of the truck door closing. Boone walked a few steps forward. Silas didn't. Boone took off his hat. "Didn't think I'd ever see you again," he said. Silas looked down at the ground, then back up. "I didn't think I'd want to." His voice was steady, but raw. Boone nodded slowly. "You came anyway." The silence between them was thick, but not hostile. "Not anymore." Boone gestured toward the old horse resting beneath the tree. "He waited for you too." Silas looked over, and something inside him broke. His throat tightened. His jaw clenched. Then, slowly, he walked toward Justice, toward the memories, the grief, and the chance to finally make peace. Silas crouched beside Justice, his hand hovering just above the horse's flank. He was afraid to touch him at first, like he might break whatever fragile connection still lingered there. But when his fingers finally made contact, the horse didn't flinch. He let out a slow exhale, as if he recognized him. Silas swallowed hard. "He looks tired." Boone, standing a few feet behind, nodded. "So am I." The words hung between them, heavy as the dusk settling across the sky. Silas stood and turned to face his father. For a moment, neither spoke. The hurt between them wasn't born of one moment, but of years stacked in silence. Missed birthdays, unanswered calls, and the funeral where they stood on opposite sides of the room, unable to look each other in the eye. "I thought you stopped caring," Silas said finally. Boone didn't respond right away. He looked down, then up. "I never stopped. I just stopped knowing how to show it." Thatcher stayed back, watching the scene unfold from a respectful distance. He'd seen reunions before, But this wasn't one of those clean, happy endings people loved to read about. This was raw, unfinished, real. He quietly snapped one photo, Boone and Silas framed by the dying light, their shadows stretching toward each other but not yet touching. Boone motioned toward the bench beside the trailer. Silas followed. They sat, not shoulder to shoulder, but close enough. "I read the letter," Silas said. "Mom's letter." Boone turned his head slowly. "I didn't even know she left it for you," Silas continued. "I found it in the attic last year, tucked in her sewing box. I just wasn't ready to read it until last week." Boone's lips parted slightly. "What did it say?" Silas looked straight ahead. "It said to forgive you, that you were doing your best, that we both were." For a long while, they sat in silence, broken only by the distant sound of cicadas and the occasional shuffle of Justice's hooves on dry ground. Boone finally spoke. "I never meant for the horse to carry all this." Silas shook his head. "He didn't. We did." The sentence settled over them like dust, soft but undeniable. Then Silas stood. "Can I stay a while?" he asked. Boone nodded once, eyes glinting in the fading light. "You already are." And behind them, Justice watched, blinking slowly, as if waiting to exhale. Just a little longer. The stars had taken over the Texas sky by the time Boone lit a small lantern outside the trailer. The light cast a warm glow over the dry dirt and the weathered wood of the bench, where he and Silas now sat side by side. Neither man spoke much after the sun went down. But something had shifted, not in words, but in the way they sat, in the fact that they were still there, together. A stillness had settled over them, not uncomfortable this time. Just real. Boone poured 2 cups of black coffee from a tin kettle and handed one to Silas. "Tastes like mud," Boone muttered. Silas took a sip and winced. "Somehow, I missed it." They shared the faintest laugh, short, awkward, but honest. It was the first time in years they'd laughed at the same thing. Boone looked out toward Justice, lying under the tree, his body still, his breathing slow and shallow. "He's close," Boone said softly. "He's holding on longer than he should." Silas leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the ground. "Why didn't you put him down?" he asked. "Most people would've." Boone didn't answer right away. "Because I owe him something," he said. "He was there when no one else was. He stayed when I pushed everyone away. And I think, maybe he's waiting for me to forgive myself first." Silas nodded slowly, the weight of those words settling into his chest. A breeze rustled the dry grass, and somewhere nearby, a coyote howled. Justice lifted his head slightly, then rested it back down. Boone stood and walked over, kneeling beside the horse. "It's all right, old boy," he whispered. "You did your part." Silas watched, his throat tightening. It had taken him years to come back. And now, as he looked at his father beside the dying horse, he felt like time was slipping through his fingers all over again. He walked over, knelt beside Boone, and placed a hand on Justice's side. The horse's ear flicked once. "Thank you," Silas whispered. Boone looked over at him, and for the first time in decades, there were tears in his eyes, not from loss, but from the quiet ache of reconnection. "He waited for you," Boone said. "So did I." The three of them sat there in silence, man, son, and the soul that had carried them both. And though no one said the word, they all knew the goodbye was near. Morning broke with a quiet chill, the kind that settles on your skin like memory. The sky was pale, streaked with orange and silver. Boone stood at the fence line with a wool blanket wrapped around his shoulders, watching the horizon without blinking. Silas had already saddled the truck, but he hadn't left. He couldn't. Justice lay on his side near the tree, breathing slow, eyes barely open. The ground around him was still, too still. Boone knew what was coming. Justice was waiting for one last moment, and Boone wasn't going to let him go alone. Silas walked up beside his father, hands in his jacket pockets. "We can call someone," he said, voice low. "A vet." Boone shook his head slowly. "He doesn't need someone else. He needs me." Silence fell again. Not awkward, sacred. Silas placed a hand on Boone's shoulder, and for the first time since he was a teenager, Boone didn't flinch at his son's touch. Thatcher arrived not long after, camera in hand, but he didn't raise it. He didn't ask questions. He simply stood at a distance, hat in hand, eyes lowered. Even from where he stood, he could feel it, the final chapter of something ancient, heavy, and unfinished. Boone turned to him and gave a nod. "No more pictures." Thatcher nodded back. "Understood." Boone knelt beside Justice and placed a gentle hand behind the horse's ear. "You can go now," he whispered. "You did what no one else could." He rested his forehead against Justice's face. "You brought my boy back." A long breath escaped the horse's lungs. His eyes, though dim, stayed on Boone. The silence that followed was louder than thunder. Then, as the breeze picked up and the leaves rustled overhead, Justice gave one last exhale. His chest rose, and didn't fall again. Boone stayed like that for several minutes, forehead pressed to the stillness, shoulders trembling, but he didn't cry, not the way most people do. His grief was quiet, reverent. Silas stood behind him, tears in his eyes, remembering a childhood filled with laughter, hay dust, and that same horse running across the pasture with wild grace. They had both lost something, but neither of them was alone anymore. As Boone stood, his legs unsteady, Silas caught him. Not just with hands, with presence, with forgiveness. Boone looked at him and said only 3 words, "I'm still here." Silas nodded, wiping his face. "Me too, Dad." And beneath the tree where Justice had laid down for the last time, the roots of something new finally began to grow. The ground where they buried Justice was soft from the rain that had come during the night, the first in weeks. Boone dug the final bit of soil with steady hands, then stood back as Silas lowered the wooden cross they'd carved together the night before. It wasn't elaborate. Just a single piece of cedar, sanded smooth, with Justice's name burned into the surface. Boone looked down at it, eyes tired but clear. "He never asked for anything," he said, "except to be seen." After the burial, the small crowd began to disperse. A few old neighbors, some who had read the article, and even Grady Kane, who hadn't spoken to Boone in 15 years. He gave Boone a silent nod before walking off, hat in hand. No speeches, no dramatic gestures, just presence, the kind that meant more than words. Boone stood quietly, the sun warming his back, and felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. Back at the trailer, Silas helped Boone pack what was left. The lot was almost empty now. Thatcher stood nearby, hands in his pockets. "You ever think about what you're gonna do now?" he asked. Boone gave a faint smile. "No, but I know it'll be different." Silas looked at his father. "Come stay with us for a while," he said. "Lena wants to meet you. Ellie too." Boone raised an eyebrow. "Ellie?" Silas smiled. "Your granddaughter." Boone chuckled, the sound dry and rusty, but real. "You named her after your mother." Silas nodded. "She deserves to know where she came from." Boone looked out toward the field where Justice once ran, a blur of strength and freedom. "Maybe I do too," he said softly. For a long moment, they stood there in silence. Then Boone picked up the last box, shut the trailer door, and turned to his son. "Let's go home." As they drove away, the trailer bouncing gently behind them, Thatcher snapped one final photo. Boone in the passenger seat, Silas at the wheel, the open road stretched ahead. He wouldn't publish this one. It was just for them. A private record of something no headline could ever explain. The end of grief. The beginning of grace. And beneath the cedar cross where justice now rested, the wind moved through the grass like a whisper. Not all things are lost. Some just wait to be found again.